you're starting to see the difference between him and Plato. I mean, we're going to see very distinct understandings of how you know something. One or two of you asked about, the immortality of the soul and reincarnation with him, and I kind of like left it. Maybe it was after class, I can't remember. You're going to see, Aristotle doesn't really follow that. I wanted to take, do you ever see the painting of Aristotle and Plato in the Academy? It was something was definitely worth listening to, right? Did you ever see the painting where it has Aristotle going like this and has Augustine pointing up? I'm trying to think of what it is. The whole reason for that is the painter's trying to tell you, Plato's like, it's there, whatever's real's up there, and Aristotle's going, no, it's right here. I mean, they're on polar opposites when it comes to that. So when you have Plato being an idealist, right? You're going to have Aristotle. He's more of a realist. It's right here, okay? Which is maybe in some ways why you see even in Christian circles they really draw, like Thomas Aquinas and such, they draw off of Aristotelian metaphysics more so than Plato. Not always. Augustine didn't. Right? And anyway, let's get started here. Let me get in my frame of mind. He let some things hang though too, so he's not maybe as bad in our mind as Plato and letting things just sit, but he doesn't answer everything as he goes along. All right, so this word wasn't in there per se, but he's really talking about the mind. We have a lot of confusion in our modern understanding of the mind. Some people can't separate the mind from the brain. They think that the brain is your mind. And if you're a materialist, that's probably going to be true. So which is why you would see somebody that say, can we take the brain out of an individual and put it into a vat and hook electrodes up to it? Does that hold all the memories? Does that hold everything else? Aristotle would be like, just no way. That's impossible, right? You couldn't do that. That's not the person itself. And you don't see the same type of dualism either with Plato. Plato is very distinct between this body and soul. He talks about these both, but we're going to see that he has a little bit different understanding. So this word nous, it just depends on how it's translated. But at least in this regard, thinking and knowing and perceiving, it's really all in the same sort of language that he uses the term. All right. Now, here's the thing. He almost plays the mind as what they call the blank slate, right? The tabula rasa. So you have this mind, and he calls it the material cause. There's a few things to keep in mind here. I'll try to use different language to keep in your head. When he uses the word material here, we're not talking about like physical stuff. If you can remember, like the four causes of Aristotle, the one thing about the material is it can change, right? Which is why the form, was that thing that never changes. And that, Plato was big on that, right? The form exists in that heavenly realm and it's never changing, which is why you could have certainty about things and then we recollect that somehow. Well, Aristotle's using these causes, and we're only reading one little part of this. I mean, he's written so much, and we don't have a lot of what he's written, unfortunately. What they have of him is mostly like lecture notes, pretty much. Nonetheless, and to read his metaphysics, I took a graduate course in Aristotelian metaphysics, and we literally went through line by line. I mean, I just wanted to jump off of something tall. And I remember when we were done, the professor said, congratulations, you're probably one of a handful of people that have gone through it. That was a little restricted, right? Sometimes you want a broader way. You got that other places, but we're only getting a view of Aristotle through this part of the Anima. We're not, all his other writings and such, we haven't even really looked at. So you have this mind, which is really, it's the material cause, which means it's potential. It can change, right? And again, potential isn't just a possibility. Potential means that, it can receive things, right? Then the object sensed on the outside, if you want to get his epistemology, how you know something, your senses are going to have to recognize something on the outside. And the form exists within that. So do you remember how with Plato the form was sort of like up there in the heavenly realm? With Aristotle, it doesn't exist on its own somewhere, all right? I'm just kind of giving you some background, hopefully to help you understand this. But a form never exists without some material aspect. So if we're going to say what's the form of a pencil, there's no perfect pencil somewhere, right? There is a form, but it's only with that where the pencil is. So that's why it's so important that, you know, the real is here. So you can see right off the bat, he doesn't have the same issue with the senses that Plato had by seeing things within the cave. He's going to say, no, we need all of our five senses have to come together on that thing. So whatever happens then is when these two things come together, right, the actuality then is the perceiving of the thing. So if you can imagine it, think of it almost as like the mind is this, you know, blank receiving potentiality. And we'll say later about what it is or isn't. And then Aristotle says you see something out there, or you hear something, or you feel something, whatever it might be, and then that object has the form, and then your mind as the material cause receives the form, and that results in knowledge and perceiving and such.
So, what do immaterial things for Aristotle not have forms then? Like,
no, they have forms because, see, you know, first of all, material, you know, even the object you sense is also composite of form and material, okay? So if we see a pencil, that's not pure form. There's just a form within the pencil. Let me back up a little bit, because sometimes, and you have to forgive me, I forget what we might get into in the future, so if we have to come back to this, we will. You can see here that he's talking about something has an essence, all right? And it always has that essence. So when we see something like a pencil, you know, Aristotle would say, well, all pencils have that form. Now, if that sounds a little odd to you, we don't live in an age where you have a lot of people who will say there's a nature to a thing. A lot of times people will say the nature is constructed. You know, it's what we say it is. A lot of this came from the medieval period, and it's a form of epistemology called nominalism. And if you're an atheist today, you would hold this, all right? So they're just names that we give. So why would we call all things pencil? Well, we categorize them. So they don't have a nature that they share. They all have something that are similar, so therefore we have called that nominalism. We've given it the name. But there's no nature within that. So you can almost see in that regards how a nature can be constructed and imposed on something. If you wanted to bring that to ethics, it kind of gets a little goofy too, because if you believe in any sort of deity, then you can really only follow rules, because there can't be a nature to the human person if we say, well, this is good for us. Well, who says it's good for you? You know, I mean, you wouldn't have that. There's no connection there. So this affects a lot of different stuff per se. Now, the difference is again, Plato said that these natures exist somewhere separate. Aristotle's saying, no, they never exist except in that particular object. Here's something else. Aristotle would probably make this argument. You know, if we had, unfortunately all these chairs are identical, but if we had, you know, 5 different chairs, we had a rocking chair, we had a desk chair, we had a stool, you know, and I would say these are all chairs. I'd have to ask you, well, what makes that a chair? And a nominalist would just say, well, look, they're all similarities that we group together. A realist like this would say, no, you know, there's a nature to the chair. Yes, the matter differs, right? And even in Christianity, I'm not even trying to bring it back to that, but it might help if you guys hold a Christian deism, is what would make all humans alike? Well, there's a nature, right? So what's the form that we share? The soul. So we share this form, and then that form then makes us all of the same nature. You'd have to get that from Aristotle. With Plato, you'd have to, you couldn't do it exactly the same way. And in nominalism, you lose that altogether. You can only say, well, we're just calling this human nature. There's really nothing there. And philosophers have argued over this for quite some time. And if that seems like, well, this is just all, you know, talk, who cares? Well, when you develop governments and you're trying to say what's just in this government, and we want a just society, you're right back to where, Socrates is. What is justice? Somebody's got to say what justice is. Well, is it justice because you say it is? Is it justice because it's powerful? Or is it justice always? Is justice a virtue? I mean, you're going to go right back to that. And then you're going to say, well, if you're going to determine in society what's good for the human person, how do you know what's good for the human person? Is it just, you're just asking? Are we just getting opinions? Are we just constructing this? Like we don't do this with our health, right? Like our health, we are pretty certain that some things are better for us than others. We may not know it perfectly. I mean, nutritionists don't have the same empirical studies that some other, types of applications would be. But nonetheless, we know that, look, you can't eat cupcakes for breakfast, lunch, and dinner for the next 10 years. Like, who was that guy that he ate either McDonald's or something? Did you hear that? How long did it take until he got really sick, right? Was it a month? Is that all it took? Wow. So, somebody would be a little odd to make the argument that our bodies aren't designed for a certain nutrition. Okay, but then maybe we can see that, but we can't really tell like what would be a good type of government for the human person. That's where the political philosophy comes in and such. So that's where this is all sort of coming from, right? So you have this. So for Aristotle, you have this mind, and what it's pure potential. It's almost like it's ready to receive anything, and when it sees the object, or feels it, it senses it somehow, and there's a form within that. And the form then is received into the mind, and then that becomes perception, that becomes knowledge, that becomes these things. Which means, I guess I already kind of reiterated that. The mind is just, it collects all these things, right? It's the place for all these. So it's almost like a blank slate bringing it in. Which means that if we could think of the mind prior to any of this, we'd have to say it's not a real thing. I mean, it's there, but we're talking spiritual here too. And this really, I mean, if you were into consciousness and stuff, trying to figure out how this all works, this is really where philosophy and science are really on the same plane. Once you start, neurologists or neuroscientists might try to talk about how the mind comes to consciousness, and philosophers can do the same thing. You're probably not going to have an advantage or disadvantage in those two arguments because we're talking about something that's immaterial, but just because it's immaterial doesn't mean it's not made of matter, right? I mean, remember, the matter, at least the way Aristotle's using it here, isn't necessarily physical stuff. It's that it's potential, right? That it can receive something, and as long as it can receive something. So we still struggle with this, right? With this conscious, and like, what does it mean? Which is kind of got Descartes screwed up a little bit, right? I mean, if you have his view on it, conscious is almost like a box that things get put into. Other people would say, well, no, we're never conscious until we're conscious of something, right? I mean, it's almost like it's the intermingling of the two things that brings us awareness of what's going on. So there's a lot of exciting stuff here, but what you'll find is, I don't care what discipline you guys go to in your lives, if you get high enough in it, you almost, you think, well, my thinking's into clouds. No, you almost get into philosophical thinking. It has to go there at some point. I have a friend I just Skyped with the other day. He was actually a student of mine in a morality course, but he has a PhD in astrophysics, engineering, and we were talking about that. Well, that once you start talking about multi-universes and the ideas of black hole, I mean, you're really in theoretical philosophical stuff. I mean, of course, they've got to prove it on the ground, but they're always way ahead of any of the empirical things that are coming up. So anyway, you might find it interesting, maybe not. And by the way, the chapters in this thing, think of it like the Bible. Nobody wrote the Bible in chapters and verse, right? At some point around, the end of the first millennium, somebody said, hey, let's put these things in the verses and chapters. The same thing here. Aristotle did not write this, and it was divided into chapters, or books they would call it. In the ancient world, they called them books, we call them chapters. So, when you get from, especially into chapter 5 here, it seems like, well, why is this a separate section? It's not. I don't know the meaning behind some of the divisions. It's almost important to recognize that it's artificial. because you might be thinking he's going to an entirely different thought, and he's not at that point. So let's see, I want to make sure I'm not forgetting something here. Oh, I guess I should go back to say this. He was talking to you about the mind being part of the body. And he doesn't quite solve this, right? But he's almost saying it can't be part of the body. Because if it was part of the body, then couldn't the mind sense? And the mind can't sense. Only the body can sense. So you're going to see that, remember the division of the soul? If you want to, again, he said there's parts, but he also said, are there parts? Right? The vegetative, the rational, and the animal. Well, maybe two of those, he says two of those can have like some aspect to sensory, but not the rational part. So we're going to see off the bat here, and we'll see it in this section, that there's no way these things can exist separately, right? The idea of like the soul, being able to exist on its own in a previous existence or a future existence, he'd be like, that's absurd. They can't be. And he kind of said that too. I mean, he, theoretically he was like a pupil, not directly, but underneath the tutelage of Plato. But these guys all disagreed with each other, right? I mean, they were, and they were also working off the pre-Socratics, which we didn't even touch, right? You saw some of the names pop up in the reading, but we didn't really look at any of the pre-Socratics. And again, these guys did pretty good. When you think about, their idea of elements were air, water, fire, and think of how far they came in their thinking. I mean, think of what we have available to us. Could you imagine, I would imagine that Aristotle's mind was about as close to Google in those days as you could possibly get. Nonetheless, all right. Now, I'm trying to keep this simple here. I don't want to get too far, but he's trying to start this idea about, can we literally like divide things? Are there parts? And what does that mean if we're going to say that there are parts? And can we say that the same parts in all different ways? So if we were to take any line, right, it's really like he says you can't even really like talk about another, like a division of this line until you've actually divided it. You might be able to say abstractly, well, I'm thinking of a line and I'm thinking of dividing a line, but if you try that in your head, the minute you say I'm thinking of dividing the line, you've already divided it. It's like it's poof. It's like we don't really know how to disconnect, this way of thinking. But the difference here is, you can divide the line no matter where you want to put it. And if I were to go and break that where that arrow is, and I were to show you those two things separately, you would call them both lines. It doesn't look like we made two different things. Now, here's Aristotle, not in this particular work. Are you guys familiar with like Zeno's paradox? Does anybody know Zeno's paradox? Anybody ever hear of that? Did you? Do you know anything about it? You want to give it a shot?
Is this the one about halves?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So it's like some guy is racing against, I forget, it's like some animal or something.
It was the tortoise and Achilles. It was
Achilles. And so the tortoise is already ahead of Achilles, and every, I forget, like X amount of time, Achilles is covered half the distance between him and the tortoise, but the tortoise has moved a little bit now. And so every time Achilles goes half the distance, so he can never actually make it all the way there because he's only ever covering half the distance. But the time that's happening in is also getting cut in half, so it's like infinitely small time, but also infinitely small distances.
Okay, that's pretty good. Anybody want to add anything? Picture two trains. Let's put it this way. Let's say that you're going to you're in your car, and I'm telling you drive right to the wall, but don't worry about hitting it, because you can't hit it. You're going to say, what do you mean I can't hit it? Well, because see, if there's 10 meters between you and the wall, can you cut that in half? Yeah, it's 5 meters. Okay. So at some point, you're going to reach 5 meters. Okay, now how much distance is there between you two? Well, there's 5 meters. We'll cut that in half. 2.5 meters. Okay, now your car is 2.5 meters. Cut that in half. It might be into this. Oh my God. Isn't it amazing when your mind goes? It might be so minute how much space is left. But if you constantly are dividing the distance between you and the object that you're going to hit in half, then you're never going to hit it. So this, so Zeno's like, so there you go. So it's an illusion. movement's an illusion, and time and everything else. Now, it might seem real easy to fix. Aristotle said, well, okay, you're mixing up a couple things here, right? He says, first of all, we're talking about the differences in time, and we're talking about a measurable segment. And he's trying, anyway, he solves it a little bit. And I say that because I didn't want to get any farther than this, because there's like, I don't know, a dozen Zeno paradoxes, and some people say, well, Aristotle was really only addressing one aspect of it. He really didn't address the whole thing. But nonetheless, the rest of us that are just common sense folk know that you're going to hit the damn wall. I don't care. You can keep measuring a half and a half. He did the same thing with an arrow, right? If you shoot an arrow, he didn't use a train. So he said if you shot an arrow, would it ever hit the target, that kind of thing. So the idea is that even if we were to divide this, right, as the objects, we could still wind up with the same two. So he's here talking about exactly how these objects would relate to our thoughts and such. But you can't do the same thing with substances, right? If we say we divide a line in half and we have two lines, and even those two lines, we'd still call them lines, and we could divide those two lines again. Fine. But we really can't do that with substances. You're not going to divide you and I. We're not going to divide the cat in half. We're not going to, now even a tree. We might say, well, okay, we can envision all these things happen. It's not like we can't have an imagination and think, well, I could picture a human being cut in half. I've seen magic tricks. That's not what he's talking about. He would actually, I think he might have referred to it. You have to forgive me. Sometimes I forget if I'm reading from a commentary or if I'm reading from the text. But he talks about those as accidental type divisions. So in other words, if somebody did split this dude in half, nobody's going to say, we have two people. You're not going to come up with that conclusion. The same way, if we divided a line in half, nobody would argue. We have two lines. And we recognize them both as different lines, right? So, let me make sure I'm not missing something a little more. Okay, let's get back to this part. He's trying to talk in terms of the body and the soul being divided. In other words, he's saying it's a substance in the same way, and it's not like a line. You can't separate the soul. So even though we can talk in terms of an abstract, well, the soul and the body are two things, we can't ever picture those things being separate. The minute that soul, which animates, remember last class we talked about it animates the body, the minute that it animates the body and it provides the form, now you have a human person. There was no human person before that. And after that, all you're going to have is a corpse. So he said, so it's a little ridiculous for us to talk about the soul separated from the body. What would that be? Now, even Christianity struggles with this sometimes, right? So Thomas Aquinas, and a lot of what you hear, at least in popular theology, is they'll borrow this, and they'll say, well, the soul, is the form of the body, and Christ died for humankind, which we all share in that nature. And the human body, the human person is body and soul. Okay, then what happens when we die? I'm pretty sure our bodies don't go with us. It's just the soul. Yes, well then how do I maintain my identity? Now there's plenty of ways to do that, but it gets a little more difficult. And even Thomas Aquinas and such said, well, then what are we talking about with angels and such and other persons like that? They have no material aspects to them, right? So anyway, this all gets worked out in different ways. For instance, even with us, I'm jumping ahead because Aquinas really takes off of Aristotle. This is what they call individuation, right? Now, in the medieval period, I have a book that's probably about 3 or 4 inches thick just on the theories of individuation from the medieval period. In other words, what makes you different than I? What is that? If we share the same exact form and everything gets received like that, okay, but do we just look different? So Aquinas will say, well, it's substantial matter, right? It's this matter, it's not that matter. Other people who I actually prefer would talk almost like in terms of like an onion skin, there's all these skins, so there's all these different types of things that go together, and the forms are all part of that. Inside that somewhere is the vegetative, outside of that is the sensual, and then beyond that is the rational, and there's other ones too. But then they can't really say, what is this then? They literally use words, and I know you're going to find it silly, but they use words like it's thisness. They use it in the Greek, hexidity, but nonetheless, it just means it's thisness. I mean, whatever this is. And on some way, that sounds like it's an out, right? Because sometimes you hear that in philosophy. It's like, why don't they just say it? Because it might not be a way to articulate it. Remember, Plato kind of left some things hanging. It's like, look, we don't have really a good way to describe that because we're always searching for analogies as humans. What's it like? Okay, well, it's like this, but it's never going to be just like that. That analogy is going to always be weak. You even hear that like in life. What's life? Well, life is like a game of baseball. Well, you can make some general assumptions, but everybody's going to no, it isn't. Because, we don't have to have just 3 strikes. We don't have to do this. There's just scores. So if you beat the analogy up, but all you're trying to do is you're just trying to constantly throw stuff out there and say, yeah, but it's similar to this, okay? So nonetheless, the soul indivisible from the body. So just keep that in the back of your mind. That is a clear distinction from Plato. There is absolutely no way that the soul is going to exist before. But see, it doesn't have to exist before in his epistemology because he's not taking the recollection. For Aristotle, I am getting my intellect and my apprehension from whatever I am sensing. And he'd even say, if the soul really had some material aspect to it, then the soul would be able to feel things. But it can't. So if it can't feel things, then it has to be immaterial. And if it's immaterial, then it has, but it can't just simply be something that's divine in his book. So he's saying, look, it's not a real thing in sense. It only receives the forms into it, that kind of thing. Nonetheless. Now, here's an interesting thing, and he brings this up here, and again, you really could not study the history of philosophy without getting into Catholic philosophy. You couldn't. I mean, so much, even my friends who are atheists that I, have as colleagues, they had to study what we call Christian, but it was pre-Reformation, so it was Catholic philosophy, because you can't get away from it. A lot of these guys, especially with Aristotle, he was kind of lost for a little while, and the Islam world actually found him. But then, at least Aquinas and those brought him into the West that we know of. And this is all Western philosophy. We're not talking Eastern here. So people start talking about how can God make something that's evil? That becomes like a struggle for us. Well, that doesn't even make any sense. If he's all good, where does the evil come from? And believe it or not, I've had friends where this has destroyed their faith because they can't get over this. I mean, a 1-year-old having cancer and dying, this is ridiculous. What kind of God is this, right? Well, Aristotle, maybe it wasn't working that out per se, but he was still trying to say, but when we're talking about something, what can we talk about its opposite in the same way? In other words, there's really no opposite to the soul is where he's going to go with this. I mean, there's no opposite to the soul. So a privation is where there is not that thing. So black is not a color. Black is the absence of color. Now, somebody might want to argue that, right? But as far as light waves go, I think it's pretty clear. So when we're calling something black, we're really talking about something that is nothing. It's not there. We're not seeing anything. If we were to talk about evil, evil is just where there's no good. So you can almost picture, like if you had a dark room, a pitch black room, and you had a candle in it. It didn't matter how, minutiae the flame was. That flame would be indistinguishable from the darkness. And the darkness would never be able to overcome it. I don't want to sound apocalyptic, but it would never overcome that, even that little flickering flame. But if you went and put out that flame, total darkness. So it's the absence of that light, right? So the same way with evil. Somebody would say, well, how then do you explain evil? Now, remember when we looked at Augustine came out of the Manichaean world. And the Manichaean world had a pretty good way to do it. They said, well, there's 2 equal powers in the world, good and bad, and they're fighting and they're battling. And, we're part of that struggle. Okay, well, you can agree or disagree, but that now makes sense. I know why everything's so lousy around here. I know why it rains. I know why there's car accidents, and so on and so on. So how does somebody who says, well, no, it's impossible. Like when I was in undergrad, I had a philosophy professor. He was a Presbyterian minister who did not believe that God was all good. And the only reason we know that is because he brought it up when we started talking about this stuff. And he said, and his whole idea was there's absolutely no way that God can be good. And he started explaining and everything. Okay, so without saying he's right or wrong at this point, you could tell he was totally rejecting Aristotle's argument. You know, Aristotle would say, no, whatever you're calling evil is the absence of good. Here's another way to say it. If I were to ask you, like if some guy had like a button-down shirt on, what is your buttonhole? Is your buttonhole the shirt? It's the hole in the shirt, so it's the absence of the shirt. Now, I mean, it's not like I understand we're calling it part of the shirt, but you wouldn't really call the space in the buttonhole part of the shirt. It's the absence of the shirt. So in the same way, the way that somebody would say, or he would say, here, there's evil in the world. No, it's the absence of goodness. In the same way that a dark room is just the absence of any light there. You know, do you kind of get it? So he's saying, so, we can talk in opposites sometimes, but there's no opposites to the soul. So we really can't talk in the absence of that. He's really like making a few different arguments here about how he divides this and that. But his overarching point is like, look, body and soul always together. You're missing one of them, you no longer have a human person.
So then he's disagreeing with the opposites argument.
Yeah, from Plato. Yeah. Well, absolutely. Remember Plato.
Plato was saying that it kept going after. Like,
Yes.
the soul.
Yeah, he was making the
cyclical.
Yeah, cyclical, absolutely. Yeah, because he doesn't agree with that. He's like, no. He goes, first of all, you're wrong. The souls aren't recollecting anything. We don't get our information, from a previous existence.
So he thinks it's solely from the senses.
Absolutely, yeah. That's why I really wanted to bring that photo. Let me see. I should have these graphics. You guys pay a lot of money to come here. I should have all kinds of bells and whistles. Let's see. I really did, though. I meant to do that. I don't know. I just got thinking here. I can't remember what exactly it's called, but I'll get the picture up on, as Mrs. Bujno was saying, on the World Wide Web. Big here. Let's do it this way. I'll take a snapshot of it and then blow that up. Well, hopefully you can see it here. What the heck happened? Bro. This is not real. I know it's hard to see. Which one's Aristotle? My left or my right? Which one's Aristotle? Come on, raise your hand if you think the guy on the left is Aristotle. Is the guy on the left Aristotle? My left. Is this guy Aristotle? Raise your hand if you think he is. Okay. 5 points to Gryffindor. Yes. See? Right here. He's like, this is what's real. And Plato, the old guy's going, yo, dude, it's up there. That's where they're at. And Aristotle's like, no, they're right here. I mean, the painter was basically building the metaphysics into the painting, right? Letting you know which is which. So this is the School of Athens, or the Academy, I guess, depending on how you understand it.
So did more people agree with Plato or or?
It just depends. I mean, it really, it just, Augustine was much more Platonic. Now, you never could just like take these people, without some tweaking. I mean, but they built these systems. So in one way, like we can at least talk in terms of Christianity. The whole idea of the heavenly realm and the perfections existing here, thank you, Plato. I mean, that's where it kind of came from. But the idea that, at least in sacramental liturgies, that you can have bread and wine and everything else, thank you, Aristotle. I mean, they grab. So the one thing, at least you can say, Catholic Church doesn't always get stuff right, but what it does do is it takes whatever it finds to be good, and it just takes it, and almost to the point where it doesn't even. The actual word they call it is it baptizes. They just grab it, and they don't have a problem taking what would otherwise be known as pagan thinkers, and they're like, no, that makes a lot of sense. I think we can use that. We just got to fix it around a little bit. All right. So anyway, it would all depend on who you're talking to and about. All right, because the one thing about philosophy, it's not dogmatic. It's all in the argument. It's like, well, how well can you make your argument? And they'll disagree until the end days. So anyway. Just to reiterate, the soul and the body are always, there's no way to divide. No way to divide these things, okay? We're talking about substances here. We're not just talking about a line we're cutting in half. You can't draw a line through the soul and the body and say, well, no, we'll put the soul over there and the body over here. These things, it's the only thing that makes you a human person. So
why are they separate then if they're always together?
Well, they're only separate in the sense of us speaking about it, per se, all right? So, but they're not separate as in different existences. Yeah, Nicole?
Does Descartes have different opinions of soul and body?
Yes, absolutely. Because, Descartes' going to come at it from a different view. Like, remember, first of all, Descartes' going to just throw everything out, right? I don't trust none of this crap that came before me. And he goes, and he started out with one premise. I only will believe what I can know absolutely. None of these guys did that. If you would have held that same criteria to Aristotle and Plato, we would have been done with them in about the first 5 minutes. I mean, they were much more comfortable with saying, hey, we'll think about this, or we'll let it lay, or we'll let that unresolved. Descartes would have gotten rid of it. So for Descartes, this idea of the mind was the only thing that was real, and outside we have no idea. So the mind almost was the entirety of the human person for him, and the senses, I just don't agree with them whatsoever. Plato didn't disagree that the senses can mislead, but he also didn't cast them away. He just said, it's going to be shadowy. I mean, there's no way you're going to get what you need. Aristotle's going to be like, no, look, the object that's out there, this is how we're going to know. So there's a form that it doesn't exist on its own. It's not like there's a form of there's a pencil form floating out there, and it's like, don't think like this thing's like an empty can and something goes in it. It's like the fact that it's been created, that form then is part of it. And again, this you can go back to what's today, Wednesday? Go back to Monday with the stamp and the wax, right? I mean, forget about the stamp there. If we saw a piece of wax, like a seal, and it was stamped in it, we would know that there's something that did that. We couldn't imagine how, if we took away the actual form, it would just melt back down. I mean, you might take a blowtorch to it and you're right back, okay, that's nothing. I mean, it's the material, the potential, and it's ready to receive the form. Boom, the stamp's over, there's its form. Now it is what it is. So how would you imagine, like if you could picture the seals they would put on the wax on the envelopes or something, how could you imagine the wax without the form it takes? It would no longer be that. All we'd have is the material, and if we had the material, it's only potential. The material is just there ready to receive the form. Just like Aristotle would say, well, the mind is just the potential, and it's ready to receive the form that we only would get through the senses. But the minute that we get it, then we have this thinking, this knowing, this perceiving, and that's how we know, right? So he was like a rationalist, really. I mean, he was like one of the first rationalists. Not the first, but he was a rationalist. And that's why his logic, would follow more syllogistic, right? It's almost like he's just going to prove things as he goes on. Plato, he's more like, a little more poetic almost. This is how I always interpreted it, right? And he gets into the dialectic and such. Just different ways to do it. Does that help? Maybe, maybe not. All right. So, talk about Descartes. Instead of I think, therefore I am, he's like I sense. So, like the knowing, he's not going to doubt that he doesn't know what he sees. Maybe it's imperfect, and even if you start getting into like the molecular stuff, well, what about atoms and molecules and everything else? None of this would break down in that, right? He still would say, well, those things themselves still have matter and form, all right? Guys, there's so many different ways. I mean, it's like people have really been struggling, and some really great scientists. Like if anybody studies calculus, do you know who Gottfried Leibniz is?
Do put the notations on to make it understandable?
Yes. Well, I mean, his idea was monads, right? He could there must be all these like little tiny monads. They're almost like little tiny things that never interact, but God almost lines them up, and they all sort of just they all work out in harmony.
This is the guy that said this is the best possible universe?
Yeah.
The best possible existence?
Yes, I mean, so they make those arguments, right? Yeah, absolutely, very good. So, I mean, everybody's just, and now you could say, but he got that wrong, okay, but he did pretty good with calculus. I mean, these, you often find people in philosophy, you'll see a lot of bleeding over with math and science and such, right? Anyway. So everything for them goes from potentiality to actuality. And I don't have anything like great and grandiose to say about this last aspect, but did you get the part where he was talking about, now the difference between, say, like us and an animal, and a vegetable would not even pick this up. But his point is like if we were on a hill or whatever, and we looked over and we saw the color yellow, we would be able to recognize it as the color yellow. Okay, so let's play this out. You saw something that is the form of yellow in the material, right? And that itself was the object then that was impressed on this potential mind. So the mind then received the form and put it together and said, this is yellow, all right? So you were able to do that. But then you saw it like moving. Oh, and it might have been like a little orange. Well, we are able to perceive that as fire. But I think he said like deers and such, I mean, other animals can perceive that as fire too. It's not like, we're not in a full human state here yet, right? But if we knew that we were part of an army unit or something, and we also knew that that wasn't us, we probably would then start to rationalize and say, this is probably the enemy's camp that we're seeing. Animals aren't going to pick that up. I mean, okay, we're animals, but you know what I mean. Let's just say we're rational animals and not get into an argument about how much more rational. The idea is that we can put these things together. So you can see how critical the senses are for Aristotle. There's something there, but it's really like my mind is this blank, potency that's ready to receive whatever forms are coming to it. I sense something, so that object then is impressed on my mind. So then the form then hits the material aspect, and one thing changed. But see, this doesn't work as absolute truth if you don't believe that the forms are non-changing, right? I mean, it has to have a nature. So when we see that, and inductive science would never go that far. The inductive science would say, well, that happened the last 3 million times. We're just going to assume it's going to happen the next time. But that's all it can really say. Aristotle's going to be like, no, look, what is in there is an eternal form. It's always that way, okay? It never exists on its own somewhere. It only ever exists in the object. But when it's in the object, then I can identify that through my senses. My material aspect receives the form, and I have cognition, if you want to call it that, right? Does that kind of make sense? I mean, it's not that hard of a thing to see. Just what I wish I would have better analogies for you to show you how this is applied, because there's so many things like today that A lot of the stuff we're not so sure of anymore. In other aspects, it seems like it's just common sense to us. But you gotta admit, the average person doesn't even think about this, you know, like, well, I see that, and that's what did I see? You know, but philosophers and cognitive scientists are constantly saying, but I don't know, how is it that I know this? I mean, just because I see it there, there's gotta be, how does this work? What happens in my brain? You know, how are the synapses firing? How this is all going? And this is why, like, from an Aristotelian point of view, neuroscience would never really be able to solve the riddle. Because it's only really looking, it's never getting to the form. So they probably have a little bit of issues with that. But anyway, there's a lot of arguments going back and forth. What do you think about this? What do you guys buy? I mean, overall, what seems easier to accept? Plato? Aristotle? What was harder to read, Aristotle or Plato?
Aristotle was harder to read for me, but I agree with his ideas.
Yeah. No,
Just because I just feel like in the Phaedo, like, it's just assumed that the soul's gonna keep going. Like, even though there are arguments that it's gonna keep going, like, it just assumes more
Yeah.
so than, like, this is just like, why would we think it would go on? It makes no sense, like, for it to just keep going.
yeah, but if it didn't keep going, things would break down in his
Yeah,
argument.
but like, also like, for the opposites argument, like, I don't really understand how like it could just like keep going into another thing, like it's from 2 forms, like
Yeah.
either of its opposite, or like, how does something from bigger like, something may be smaller and then gets bigger, but how does something bigger?
No, you're right. I mean, the reality is I think overall Aristotle is more difficult to read, but he probably fits our sensibilities a little bit more and such. It just, there's more to it, but that's it, folks.